There is a terrifying moment in engineering where a motorcycle engine becomes too fast for its own frame to handle. In the 1970s and 80s, before computers stepped in to save us from ourselves, manufacturers didn't build safety nets. Instead, they built legends out of pure adrenaline and survival rates. These are the 10 production motorcycles that became so notoriously lethal. They earned names like the Widowmaker right out of the factory crate, and exactly why riders lined up around the block to sign the waiver. Number 10. Suzuki GSX-R 1100. We are starting with a bike that turned short wheelbase into a full-blown personality trait. Produced between 1986 and 1998, the early oil-cooled models ran an inline-4 engine displacing anywhere from 1,052 cubic centimeters up to 1,127 cubic centimeters. On paper, it looked like a fairly normal sport bike. On the road, it rode like a loaded spring waiting for an excuse. Here is the actual engineering problem. Laid out plainly, Suzuki built this thing with an ultra-short wheelbase, paired it with an aggressive forward-leaning riding position, and then stuffed in an engine producing immense torque for its era. Individually, none of those three choices is particularly unusual. Combined, they created a chassis with almost no margin for rider error. Weight transfer happened fast. Too fast, honestly, for a lot of riders used to gentler machines. Riders would tip confidently into a corner, roll on the throttle the way they always had, and the bike would push wide, sometimes running clean off the pavement, because the innovative but highly flexible aluminum box section frame simply could not absorb sudden inputs with the rigidity of a modern perimeter design. Suzuki's own engineers borrowed heavily from their endurance racing program to shave off weight, which is a nice way of saying the road bike inherited a race bike's razor-thin stability margins without a race bike's closed-course track surface to count on. As the sport bike world evolved toward electronic rider aids, lighter materials, and stiffer frames, Suzuki quietly phased the 1100 out and shifted its entire engineering focus toward the smaller, sharper, and considerably more forgiving GSX-R 1000. The 1100 simply could not keep up with where the industry was heading, and everyone involved seemed to know it. The GSX-R 1100 also holds a quieter distinction. Its oil cooling system, branded SACS by Suzuki, sprayed oil jets directly onto the underside of the pistons instead of relying on a conventional radiator alone. It was a genuinely clever workaround for keeping weight down, but it meant the engine ran hotter in stop-and-go traffic than its water-cooled rivals, which is part of why buyers pushed it straight onto the highway instead. Clean examples today sell for $5,000 to $9,000, and prices are climbing fast as 1990s nostalgia hits full swing across the collector market. What was once considered an unwanted, unpredictable relic is now a genuinely appreciating asset among people who know exactly what they are buying. Experienced riders and dedicated vintage restorers who understand old-school motorcycle geometry will find a genuinely rewarding machine waiting here. Beginners who rely on traction control and ABS to bail them out of bad decisions should walk away immediately, because this particular bike has neither of those safety nets, and it will not apologize for that one bit. And if a short wheelbase alone sounds intimidating, just wait until you meet a bike that was essentially a race engine wearing a turbocharger like a loaded gun with a delayed trigger. Number 9. Kawasaki GPZ750 Turbo. Turbo lag is merely annoying in a car. On a motorcycle, it can throw you clean off the backseat before you even understand what happened. Produced from 1983 to 1985, this inline-4 engine displaced 738 cubic centimeters, and it was turbocharged, which in the early 1980s meant engineers were essentially guessing at where the safety margins should reasonably sit. This was Kawasaki's entry into a very short-lived arms race, with Honda, Yamaha, and Suzuki all rushing their own turbo bikes to market around the same handful of years. The problem was simple to describe and absolutely terrifying to actually live through. Power delivery stayed docile, almost sleepy, right up until that turbocharger finally spooled up to full boost pressure. Then, exiting a corner at a completely normal pace, the bike would unleash a sudden violent surge of power with almost no meaningful warning beforehand. riders would be leaned over mid-corner, throttle cracked open, expecting gradual, linear acceleration like any normal motorcycle, and instead get slammed with a kick, strong enough to break the rear tire loose in an instant, sending the whole bike sideways. Early, unrefined electronic fuel injection paired with aggressive wastegate calibration made the boost threshold incredibly hard to predict, leaving the surge of sudden exhaust gas velocity to spin the compressor wheel into hyperdrive right when the rider least expected it. Kawasaki eventually abandoned the entire turbo experiment altogether, along with most of the rest of the industry. The company redirected its sport bike lineup toward naturally aspirated, larger displacement engines instead, quietly admitting through its own engineering choices that turbo lag and aggressive cornering were simply never going to coexist peacefully on public roads. Today you can find one for $6,000 to $9,000. It is mildly collectible, mostly among riders who actually lived through the wild, over-engineered turbo wars of the 1980s and somehow survived long enough to tell the story afterward at bike meets. Collectors specifically interested in that era should absolutely consider one for their garage. Anyone hoping for smooth, linear, predictable power delivery should look elsewhere entirely, because predictability was never anywhere on this particular bike's spec sheet, and then, or now. Before we go any further down this list, hit that subscribe button right now. We dig up documented engineering failures like this every single week, the kind most channels gloss over, and you genuinely do not want to miss the next one landing in your feed. Now let's get back to it, because these bikes only get more unhinged from this point forward. Turbo lag is nothing compared to what happens when Porsche gets involved in Milwaukee's business, and the ground itself becomes the enemy. Number 8. Harley-Davidson V-Rod. Here's a genuine plot twist for you. Harley-Davidson partnered with Porsche to design an engine, and the result was dangerously fast for a bike shaped like a low-slung lounge chair on wheels. Produced from 2001 to 2017, the liquid-cooled Revolution V twin engine displaced anywhere between 1,130 cubic centimeters and 1,247 cubic centimeters, depending on the exact model year you found. It was, at the time, the single most powerful production engine Harley had ever bolted into a street bike. The danger here was never about raw horsepower alone. It was pure geometry, plain and simple. Ground clearance sat incredibly low, a styling decision that looked absolutely stunning under showroom lighting and became a genuine liability the very moment you hit a twisty canyon road. Riders leaning into corners with any real enthusiasm would scrape the frame or exhaust components directly against the pavement. And that sudden jarring metal to asphalt contact could lever the rear wheel unexpectedly off the ground, causing a loss of traction at precisely the wrong moment mid-turn, when there was no room left to correct it. The drag strip stance that made it a straight-line sensation is the exact same stance that made twisty roads a genuine liability. The V-Rod also introduced Harley's first mass-production use of 𝐑𝐄𝐀 4-valve per cylinder heads, utilizing liquid-cooled architecture derived from the factory VR1000 superbike racing program that Porsche helped develop for commercial scale. It was a genuine departure from the pushrod architecture Harley had leaned on for generations, and traditionalist buyers at the time were noticeably skeptical of a Milwaukee cruiser with a race-bred European heart under the tank. As rider preference gradually shifted toward performance baggers and traditional touring machines throughout the 2000s, Harley redesigned the platform and eventually discontinued the V-Rod entirely, quietly closing out one of the strangest chapters in the company's long history. Used prices today land somewhere between $8,000 and $14,000 depending on condition and mileage. It remains moderately collectible, largely because that Porsche-engineered engine is unlike anything else Harley has ever put into production before or since. Power cruiser fans and collectors chasing something genuinely different from the usual, Harley lineup should absolutely look into one. Canyon carvers who love leaning deep into corners should steer clear completely, because this bike will remind you of its ground clearance the hard way, every single time you get greedy. Low ground clearance is one thing. Up next is a bike that Suzuki basically stole straight off a Grand Prix grid, and it will not forgive you for treating it like a normal Tuesday commute. Number 7. Suzuki RG 500 Gamma. Imagine Suzuki selling you an actual Grand Prix race bike with a headlight bolted onto the front for legal street use. That is essentially almost exactly what happened here. Produced from 1985 all the way through 1989 for various global markets, the dual crankshaft, rotary valve, two-stroke square-4 engine displaced 498 cubic centimeters, and it delivered power in the most uncompromising, unfiltered way imaginable for a road-legal machine. Suzuki built it as a near-direct homage to their own factory, RG 500 Grand Prix racer, right down to the aluminum box section frame. The engineering reality was genuinely brutal once you understood it. This bike was incredibly lightweight and fast, built directly from Suzuki's own factory racing knowledge, with almost zero compromises made for everyday street use or comfort. Two-stroke power arrived peaky and unforgiving, meaning there was very little meaningful warning between. Nothing much is happening right now, and everything is happening at once, immediately. Combine that instant, violent power spike with genuinely aggressive racing geometry, and giving the throttle too much attention mid-corner could quite literally flip the entire motorcycle out from under an unprepared rider. Riders often describe the power band as a light switch, rather than a dial, which is a charming way of saying there was no middle ground. Global emissions regulations eventually caught up with two-stroke performance engines across the entire motorcycle industry worldwide, and the RG 500 Gamma was gradually phased out as the underlying technology became commercially and environmentally unviable to keep manufacturing at scale. Today, this bike sits in genuinely serious demand among collectors. Prices run $25,000 to $40,000, and it remains highly collectible among dedicated two-stroke purists scattered across the globe. Expert riders with real racing or two-stroke background should absolutely chase one down without a shred of hesitation. Street riders lacking that specific kind of experience should never throw a leg over this particular bike, because Grand Prix engineering was never ever designed with your daily commute in mind, not even a little. A race bike with a headlight is terrifying enough, but what happens when a manufacturer straps a literal fuel dumping valve onto a 1980s frame that was never built to handle it? Number 6. Yamaha V-Max. Some motorcycles exist purely to go in a straight line so fast that cornering becomes a distant afterthought. The original V-Max, produced from 1985 all the way through 2007, ran a liquid-cooled V4 engine displacing 1,198 cubic centimeters, tuned almost entirely for acceleration. Yamaha borrowed the basic architecture from a touring bike engine and reworked it purely to dominate stoplight drag racing, which is a strange origin story for something this notorious. The infamous feature here was a system called V-Boost. Past 6,000 RPM, a servo motor would pull open a set of butterfly valves in a crossover manifold, allowing two separate carburetors to feed a single cylinder simultaneously to cram maximum fuel and air into the intake port. The result was a violent, almost startling surge of acceleration that regularly overwhelmed the bike's genuinely skinny 1980s frame and its comparatively soft, underbuilt suspension, inducing a genuinely frightening high-speed wobble that riders from that specific era still talk about, decades later, usually around campfires or deep inside internet forums late at night. The engine, notably, was far ahead of the chassis wrapped around it, which is exactly backward from how a motorcycle is supposed to be engineered. Yamaha engine designers heavily redesigned the existing liquid-cooled V4 power plant from the Venture touring bike, completely reworking the cylinder heads, camshafts, and rods to handle massive high RPM loads before dropping it into a stripped-down chassis. Dyno testing, at the time, also became something of an industry talking point, since the V-Max was independently measured, making noticeably more rear-wheel horsepower than Yamaha's official factory rating suggested. Yamaha eventually gave the V-Max a complete ground-up redesign in 2009, adding a much stiffer aluminum chassis and dramatically improved braking hardware before finally retiring the entire model line for good several years after that redesign launched. First-generation examples now sell for $4,000 to $7,000, and they remain highly collectible today as a genuine icon of muscle cruiser heritage from a very different era of motorcycling. Straight-line thrill seekers and custom bike builders should absolutely own one without a second thought. Canyon carvers who fear sudden, radical power delivery. Arriving on a heavy, unwieldy chassis should never buy this bike. Full stop, no exceptions whatsoever. If you are genuinely enjoying this ride through motorcycle history so far, drop a comment down below, telling us exactly which bike on this entire list you would actually dare to ride yourself. We read every single one, and honestly, your answer might end up shaping which deadly machine we cover next. V-Boost was reckless in a straight line. Our next bike was reckless everywhere, hiding an overheating flaw inside its own suspension that nobody could see coming until it was already too late. Number 5. Suzuki TL1000S. Suzuki tried something genuinely experimental here, and it went sideways almost immediately after launch, quite literally in some cases. Produced from 1997 to 2001, the liquid-cooled V-twin engine displaced 996 cubic centimeters, and it was paired with a piece of technology that arguably had no business appearing on a mass-production motorcycle just yet. That technology was a rotary rear damper, an experimental design meant to precisely control rear suspension movement under hard, sustained loading. Under aggressive riding conditions, the damper would overheat rapidly, and once it overheated past a certain point, meaningful damping control essentially vanished altogether without warning. The result was violent tank slappers, meaning severe, uncontrollable head shake through the handlebars, powerful enough to throw riders clean off the bike with almost zero advance notice beforehand. Motorcycle journalists at the time noted that the engine itself was a genuinely excellent piece of engineering, which somehow made the damper failure feel even more frustrating. After a genuine wave of crash reports piled up across dealerships and roads nationwide, Suzuki was ultimately forced into a full factory recall, retrofitting the affected bikes with proper conventional steering dampers to correct the underlying flaw. Even with that fix eventually applied, the damage to the model's public reputation was already permanent, and it was eventually discontinued from the lineup entirely a short time later. You can find one today for $3,500 to $5,000 depending on condition. It has built a genuine cult following over the years, since making it moderately collectible among riders who specifically appreciate its unhinged, unpredictable V-twin character. Track day enthusiasts willing to upgrade the suspension themselves should absolutely consider one for weekend use. Novice riders uncomfortable with a twitchy, unpredictable front end should never come anywhere near this particular machine, no matter how good the deal looks. Up next, we are heading deep into vintage territory where the danger was not experimental technology at all. It was simply the outright limits of 1920s and 1940s engineering meeting genuinely shocking speed head-on with nothing else to blame. Number 4. Brough Superior SS100. Often called the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles, this bike earned its lofty nickname through pure, obsessive craftsmanship applied at every single stage of production. Produced from 1924 to 1940, it used an air-cooled V-twin 𝐏𝐴P engine displacing 998 cubic centimeters, hand-built to genuinely exacting tolerances rarely seen elsewhere. Every single example was individually road-tested by the factory before delivery, and buyers reportedly received a signed certificate guaranteeing the bike's tested top speed. Here's the actual problem, stated plainly. This motorcycle could push past 100 miles per hour, a genuinely shocking figure for a machine built during that particular era of manufacturing. The trouble is that tire technology, braking systems, and rigid or girder fork frames of that period were simply not engineered to handle sustained triple-digit speeds safely, not by a long shot. Riders were essentially piloting a machine considerably faster than the entire supporting infrastructure of roads, tires, and brakes surrounding it could realistically manage at the time. Roads themselves were often unpaved or poorly maintained, which turned an already precarious top speed into something closer to a gamble. Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence himself, owned a total of 7 Brough Superior motorcycles throughout his lifetime, and was riding one when he was fatally injured in a 1935 crash near his home in Dorset, England. That single event cemented the marque's reputation as beautiful, desirable, and undeniably unforgiving. Production ceased entirely at the very onset of World War II, as the factory converted its manufacturing capability entirely toward the war effort. Instead, the SS-100 never returned to production once the war had finally ended years later. Today, this bike lives in a completely different financial universe from most of the others on this list. Prices range from $200,000 to over $500,000 at serious international auction houses. It stands as an extremely collectible premium historical item now, treated more like fine art than transportation. Only ultra-wealthy vintage motorcycle collectors should genuinely consider owning one at these prices. Anyone expecting modern braking power or safe, contemporary handling characteristics should never expect to find any trace of it here whatsoever. Money and craftsmanship could not fix 1920s tire technology. Next, we head to post-war England, where an engine so advanced it broke world records also happened to double as the bike's own frame. Number 3. Vincent Black Shadow. This is what happens when raw engineering ambition outruns the available chassis technology of its own era. Produced from 1948 to 1955, the air-cooled V-twin engine displaced 998 cubic centimeters, and it made this particular bike the outright fastest production motorcycle anywhere in the entire world at the time, capable of topping 125 miles per hour on the right stretch of open road. Its massive black finished engine cases were as much a flex as they were functional, immediately telling every other rider at the gas station exactly what they were looking at. Here's the design flaw that made it legendary for entirely the wrong reasons. The Black Shadow used a so-called frameless chassis, meaning the engine itself served as a stressed structural member instead of sitting neatly inside a traditional, rigid supporting frame like most other bikes of the era. That approach saved considerable weight and looked genuinely innovative on paper at the drawing board, but it also introduced flex at high speed, causing terrifying, sudden weaves that could appear seemingly out of nowhere the moment the bike approached its true top end. The Vincent Company eventually ran into serious, unrecoverable financial trouble and ceased motorcycle production entirely in 1955, which makes every single surviving example genuinely rare on today's already thin market. Expect to pay somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000 for one right now, and rising. It remains highly collectible among serious, deeply dedicated vintage buyers around the world. Historical motorcycle purists and dedicated vintage enthusiasts should absolutely pursue one whenever a genuine opportunity arises. Riders hoping to push high speeds without any prior experience on rigid, vintage-feel machinery should never attempt to learn that particular lesson here first, of all places. A frameless chassis flexing at high speed is one kind of nightmare. Our next bike traded speed for the dirt entirely, and its flaw was baked directly into a frame built for racers half its rider size. Number 2. Suzuki TM400 Cyclone. Sometimes the danger is not found out on the street at all. It is found buried deep in the dirt instead. Produced from 1971 to 1975, this two-stroke single-cylinder engine displaced 396 cubic centimeters, and it was built from the ground up as a pure, uncompromising motocross weapon. Suzuki rushed it to market to compete with established European motocross machinery, and speed to market rarely plays nicely with careful chassis development. The problem started with the frame itself right from the beginning. It was lightweight, which sounds fantastic on paper for competitive racing purposes, but it was also notoriously weak and prone to flexing badly under any genuinely hard, aggressive riding. Layer on top of that a notorious pointless electronic ignition system that would randomly and violently advance the spark timing all at once at a specific RPM threshold. And you had a machine that genuinely felt like it possessed its own private opinions about exactly when it wanted to accelerate. Professional racers of the era reportedly nicknamed it something considerably less polite than Cyclone, though the printable version stuck for marketing purposes. Suzuki's engineers reportedly struggled specifically with power-to-weight balance, since the frame borrowed heavily from smaller displacement models never designed to handle this much torque. Aftermarket frame reinforcement kits became common within just a few years of release, essentially becoming an unofficial, rider-funded recall that Suzuki itself never formally issued. Suzuki eventually redesigned the entire platform into the far more forgiving, deliberately detuned TS400, a much more manageable trail bike overall for everyday riders, and the original TM400 Cyclone was quietly discontinued from the lineup shortly afterward without much fanfare. Today, you can find one for $3,000 to $5,500, depending on condition and originality. It remains genuinely collectible specifically among vintage off-road riders and dedicated longtime Suzuki enthusiasts. Hardcore vintage dirt bike collectors should absolutely track one down whenever the chance presents itself. Trail riders or complete beginners should never throw a leg over this particular bike, because unpredictable power bands combined with loose dirt are a genuinely bad combination to learn any lessons on. Before we finally crown the single most notoriously dangerous production motorcycle ever sold to the public, smash that like button right now. It genuinely tells the algorithm to put this story in front of more riders who need to hear it, and it costs you all of 1 second to do. Everything on this list so far was dangerous. Number 1 earned a nickname that still makes riders flinch 50 years later, and it earned it the hard way. Number 1, Kawasaki H2 750 Mach IV, and here it finally is. The bike that earned the nickname Widowmaker long before internet forums even existed to help spread that grim reputation any further. Produced from 1972 to 1975, this two-stroke air-cooled inline-3 engine displaced 748 cubic centimeters, and genuinely every single part of it was built for raw speed first, safety a distant second. Kawasaki designed it in direct response to Honda's four-stroke dominance, and the resulting engine was, by 1972 standards, almost comically overpowered for the chassis wrapped around it. The danger here came from a genuinely perfect storm of mismatched engineering decisions, stacked right on top of each other. Kawasaki built a rigid, flex-prone steel tube frame from the start, and then bolted in an engine carrying an absolutely explosive power band right on top of it. At around 5,000 RPM, the H2 would suddenly deliver a violent surge of horsepower that completely overwhelmed the chassis sitting beneath it. And this bike paired an early, wooden-feeling front disc brake with a fading rear drum, which had genuinely no hope of reeling that power back in once it had already arrived. Period road tests openly warned buyers about the front end, lifting under hard acceleration, right there in print, which tells you exactly how well known the behavior already was at launch. Word of its dangerous, unpredictable reputation spread rapidly through the street riding community almost immediately after launch. It was eventually discontinued in the late 1970s as stricter emissions regulations finally arrived and effectively ended the entire era of unfiltered, no-compromise two-stroke street bikes, just like this one, for good. Today, the H2 Mach IV sells for $8,000 to $15,000, depending on originality and condition. It remains highly collectible as a genuinely iconic piece of 1970s motorcycling history that shaped how an entire generation viewed raw performance. Experienced vintage collectors and dedicated drag racing historians should absolutely seek one out whenever the opportunity finally presents itself. Beginners or anyone expecting predictable modern cornering behavior of any kind should never get anywhere near this machine, because the Widowmaker nickname was never ever just marketing. It was, and honestly, still is, a genuine warning, earned the hard way. 10 motorcycles, 10 completely different ways that engineering ambition managed to outrun the available technology of its own particular time. Frames that flexed under real pressure, turbos that waited far too long before doing anything at all, power bands that arrived like a punch straight to the chest, with zero warning given. Every single one of these machines still has dedicated riders chasing it, down today, all these decades later, because danger, it turns out, has always carried its own strange and stubborn magnetic pull over certain people. None of them were built to be reckless on purpose. They were built at the outer edge of what their era's technology could actually control. And that edge is exactly where legends tend to get made. If this ride through motorcycling's darkest engineering chapters genuinely hooked you the way it hooked us putting it together, click the next video sitting right there on your screen, because these stories only get wilder from here.